And despite comparing the government to Nazi Germany, inspiring a woke strike that left licence fee payers paying football fans high and dry at the weekend and showing zero contrition for delivering a fatal blow to BBC's impartiality, Gary Lineker will be back on our screens this weekend. So after its Director General, Tim Davie, capitulated to the woke mob, has Lineker now made a fool out of the BBC? You can email me on this, dan@gbnews.uk, tweet me at GBNews, our poll running there too. But help me make up your mind tonight. Delighted to bring in one of the BBC's biggest names of the past, their faithfully impartial former chief political correspondent, John Sargent, who is furious with Lineker. He's alongside the former Home Affairs Correspondent at the BBC, Danny Shaw, and talent manager to the Stars, Professor Jonathan Shalit OBE. So, John Sargent, unlike me, you remain a big defender of the BBC. However, like me, you're very angry, aren't you? That Lineker has been allowed this victory and is putting impartiality at the BBC under threat.
Yeah, I mean, the point about it is people think it's all to do with freedom of speech. You know, why couldn't he speak? It's actually got very little to do with freedom of speech. It's to do with what do you do in a large organisation, particularly a famous broadcasting organisation that's trying to convince the world that it's politically impartial. Well, for goodness sake, if you suddenly put out a tweet saying the government, our government, is akin to or can be compared with Germany of the 1930s, you're bound to annoy the BBC. You're annoying your employers. So, I mean, the issue, so much
He signed the contract,
I know,
which included the impartiality guidelines,
yeah.
And for that, he gets paid from our money,
exactly.
£1.3 million. Now, you say Lineker is out of control now.
Well, I just wonder, really, if he is, maybe he's thinking, maybe he's just arrogant, right? Why don't I do what I like? But I'm not sure about that. I think he's confused when he says it's, oh, this is so surreal, and can I go to the shops with my dog? And you think, wait a moment, don't you realise the impact you've made, the damage you've done to the BBC, the consternation, the chaos that you've caused? How is that surreal? So did he not realise, did he genuinely not realise that by making this crazy comparison, he would be over the guidelines? I find that hard to believe. So is another explanation that he deliberately, is a sort of change of life moment, where he thinks, I do want to throw over the traces. Actually, I don't like all this stuff. I want to be different. Now, if that's the case, of course we know what's going to happen when the new guidelines are produced. He will not be able to accept them, and the BBC will have to sack him.
Now, Danny Shaw, you were at the BBC for 31 years. Do you feel angry with Lineker? Because he is actually undermining work that folk like you and John did for many decades, because people like me now feel like the BBC is not impartial.
I don't feel angry at him. I mean, I think he's stepped over the line completely. It's quite clear it was a breach of the guidelines that he'd agreed to.
He should be gone, shouldn't he?
No, I mean, you don't necessarily have to resign or sack someone because they breach guidelines.
What's the point in having the guidelines then?
Well, the guidelines are there to ensure that people know roughly where the limits are and to ensure that there's impartiality on the most politically sensitive subjects of the day. And there's no more politically sensitive subject than migration at the moment, domestically anyway. So obviously there needed to be some steps taken or a conversation or a review, which we're now having. I mean, when I looked at the guidelines, they are muddy. I mean, it's a typical kind of BBC fudge. And so there needs to be some clarity brought to it. And also it needs to be brought up to date to reflect the fact that there are a number of people who have views, passions, interests, which may potentially bring them into conflict. But I think what Gary Lineker didn't perhaps understand, and what some people who've commentated on this didn't understand, is that he does have a special role. I don't think it matters whether he's staff or freelance.
No, it doesn't.
He is the face of BBC football. He's, the face of other sports at the BBC. He's a regular presence on every single week.
And by the way, to say football is not political is not true. Look at the Qatar World Cup. We look at the taking of the knee. Football is such a big part of our national life. It is intrinsically political in so many ways. But Jonathan Shalit, you say this is actually all the fault of people like me. We blew all of this out of proportion, and didn't matter that Lineker compared this humane government policy, that's my opinion on the policy, to 1930s Germany. I mean, come on, Jonathan, as a Jewish man, you must think that is highly, highly offensive.
Well, first of all, I think there's a slight twist to my words. I think if you're going to talk about impartial, Dan, your introduction was the most partial introduction to argue your point I've ever heard.
I'm not being paid for by the public.
No, but the fact of the matter is, the BBC as an institution, in terms of what it represents when it comes to politics and current affairs, is impartial. The question is, if BBC want to...
Really?
Yeah, of course, when it comes to news and current affairs...
Are they impartial on Brexit?
This week, the BBC are accused of supporting the Tory party. Last year, they're accused of supporting the Labour Party. Different people, if they pose what the BBC thinks, accused of supporting the other party. If you work and deal with BBC News and Current Affairs, it's absolutely clear it is impartial, and the programmes make great effort to show both sides of the argument are presented.
John, I dispute that, John, and I think there is lots of evidence, and I'm not talking about your day, I'm not. But if you look over the past few years, you know, because senior executives at the BBC have admitted it, they were completely wrong on Brexit, and they sneered at Brexiteers, and they never thought that Brexit was going to win. They missed the Red Wall revolution of Boris Johnson. They have been absolutely partial on the trans debate. They never represented the other side of lockdown harms or vaccine injuries, which we're now seeing is becoming a huge crisis. So I'm sorry, I don't believe that BBC News is
all right, Dan, but
impartial.
let's, for the sake of argument, only for the sake of argument, accept what you're saying.
Yeah.
That is an argument for trying to pursue the idea of political impartiality.
Absolutely.
It's not
Which Tim Davies said he was going to do. And now he's thrown it out the window.
No, what has happened, and this is, I disagree with you on this, I'm afraid. What they've got is they've got into a complete panic. They don't know what to do, right? Even though this was the key policy which they should have prepared for, they were hopelessly unprepared. They were stuck with a chairman who was in the middle of a battle himself over whether or not he should have been appointed. So the only thing they could do, when I first saw the interview in Washington, I thought, how pathetic of Tim Davie. I thought, why? And when he said, I'm in listening mode, I thought, how pathetic. You know, you shouldn't be in listening mode. You should be acting. You should be thinking of what's going on. You should have planned for this. You should have known Lineker well. You should have warned him privately. So the whole thing shouldn't have happened.
And this was an oncoming car crash, wasn't it?
That's it. So it's all coming. But in fact, he didn't. So what has happened? I only think I will say this now. I now have second thoughts about this because I think the BBC needed time themselves for a breather. They've now got a chance to regroup and to fight this battle. But they were not ready to fight the battle when it happened.
Yeah, which is ridiculous, because the issue I have, Danny Shaw, with Tim Davie, is that he claimed that impartiality was going to be the most important part of his tenure as Director General. One presenter, yes, a very powerful, a very important presenter, goes off-piste, and a whole load of far more minor stars joins him. And Davie is prepared to chuck that out the window because, come on, this review, we know what's going to happen. They're going to loosen the guidelines for staff outside of news and current affairs, aren't they?
What else could he possibly do? Faced with a situation which clearly management have handled very badly, but faced with a situation where your biggest sports programmes are essentially taken off air and people are walking out the weekend threatening their Premier League rights.
Take them all. Jonathan, you would have loads of clients, Jonathan, who would love a gig at BBC Sport. Sack them all. If I didn't turn up to do my show, I would be sacked.
I have many clients who work at the BBC, and I have many clients who don't work at the BBC, who'd like to work at the BBC. I don't believe a sports broadcaster, a music broadcaster, commenting on political affairs is a sign of impartiality. What matters is, when you're watching BBC News and Current Affairs, you expect impartiality. If you're watching Strictly Come Dancing, or you're watching The Apprentice, or you're watching Football Focus, that is not, you don't need them to be impartial. That's a whole different remit. And Tim Davie, I think Gary Lineker accurately summarised, has got an impossible job. Tim Davie is actually brilliant for the BBC. He didn't... Being in listening mode is completely correct. And also, this wasn't a dramatic crisis and panic. All that happened was, on Friday, a guy was suspended. By Monday, it was resolved over the weekend.
Pretty bad.
I think it's pretty... I think the media have completely made it a bigger story.
OK, it's my fault. It's my fault.
Dan, you are the man who creates stirs for effect.